Welcome to the Story Learning Podcast, regular doses of language learning tips and motivation to help you become fluent in any language. With me, Olly Richards. For language programs, books, free resources, and much more, visit StoryLearning.com.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the I Will Teach You a Language podcast. Coming to you live from Japan. Well, actually, that's not entirely true. I am still in Hong Kong as I'm recording this. But when you hear this, I will be well and truly in Japan, probably driving down a highway somewhere looking for a hot spring and an udon shop, if possible. It's my favourite thing to do, hot spring and udon in Japan. Anyway, I also wonder what it's going to be like, actually, speaking Japanese in Japan again. Because I think I probably talked about this before, but I've got a kind of funny experience with Japanese because when I was living in Japan, I always felt that my Japanese wasn't good enough, and for obvious reasons. It never is when you're in the country, right? But it improved quite a lot since I left, because when you meet Japanese people outside Japan and they appreciate you so much speaking in Japanese, that really is a big confidence booster, right? So I wonder what it's going to be like going back to Japan after 5 years, 6 years, 5.5 years. I really can't believe it's been that long. I remember sitting on the plane as I was leaving Japan. I was on New Year's Eve, 2012, going into 2013. And I was sitting on the plane. I just got a job. I was promoted at the British Council where I was working. I was going to live in Qatar. I was sitting on that plane and I was thinking, man, I'm not ready to leave Japan right now. I'm really not. And I had big mixed feelings about it. And it was partly because so much of my improvement in Japanese had come from in the previous 6 months or so, once I finally changed up my method and started learning properly instead of just messing around with. Well, anyway, that's a story for another day. But I never would have guessed that it would take me 5.5 years to actually go back to Japan. I haven't been back since. So yeah, very much looking forward to that and to speaking Japanese in Japan again. Okay then, let's hear from Nick.
Hi, Olly. My name's Nick, and I'm from New York. I'm trying to learn Spanish. I really like the Memrise app. I just want to see what your opinion of it was. Thank you.
Hey, Nick, thank you very much for your question. This is a different kind of question, which I like. All right, so what do I think of Memrise? Okay, so a bit of background. I have used Memrise before, although not extensively. A lot of the, since I discovered the world of sort of online language learning and things like that, I've been learning languages which have not been supported widely by a lot of the popular apps and language learning platforms out there. So I've been learning Cantonese and Arabic and Thai and things like that. And a lot of those languages are not really supported, partly because of the written script makes it quite difficult for learners to actually write in those languages. So a lot of my experience with this has been kind of, with Memrise in particular, has been kind of playing around in different languages that I am familiar with and just kind of seeing how it works. And I should also say that I haven't used Memrise for the last 2 or 3 years, so it might have totally changed. But from what I understand, it's pretty much the same as it always was, because it's got a very strong kind of concept behind it, Memrise, which is, it's essentially the same as flashcards, right? So you've got an algorithm that brings words or cards, or I think they have a different term for them, whatever they call them. It kind of brings them back to you every so often and helps you recall them in different ways by recognizing them or actually inputting text and typing stuff in. And it works along that basis. A good friend of mine, Alex, actually works for Memrise, and he gives me an insight into the work that goes on there. And I know for a fact that at Memrise, they really do put an awful lot of thought into their products and what they're developing there. I know it is a company that's led by people who are really doing good work. And that's not something that can be said about a lot of different apps. So although I'm not as familiar as maybe as I should be with the ins and outs of Memrise, I have a lot of faith in the company and the people who are running it. So I am a big fan of flashcard apps, as you may know, and the reason is because I think it's a very valuable discipline to identify new vocabulary that you learned, capture it somehow, and then go back to review that vocabulary later. One of the most important principles of language learning is repetition. And that's why flashcards are so popular, and Memrise kind of works on that basis. The main difference between Memrise and standard flashcards would be that with Memrise you have a lot more different options for how to study those cards. So sometimes they'll show you a card and all you have to do is recognize it. Sometimes you've got a multiple choice, so they'll show you 4 cards and they'll say, well, which card means this? And you have to pick the other one. And then they'll show you a card with a few letters missing or a word missing, and you have to type in that word. So it challenges you from lots of different perspectives, which many people find really valuable because they like the variety of reading and writing and other forms of testing, if you like. The other thing about Memrise is they have huge libraries of decks courses which people have pre-prepared. So you have like the 5,000 most common Spanish words, or I don't know, 100 phrasal verbs in English, whatever it may be. Memrise is so popular that people have been creating these kind of decks for years now. There's lots of choice there. I think I've also used the Memrise smartphone app at some point, although again I'm not really up to date with all this stuff. Now, having said all of that, here's why I don't use Memrise personally. Firstly, I prefer, although I love flashcards, I prefer a flashcard setup which is very simple. Which is to say, I like to be able to put what I want on my flashcards and study them in the way that I want. When I used Memrise before, I found that I was being asked to do too much stuff that I didn't want to do. So I had to, type stuff in, which was partly difficult because I was learning difficult languages which weren't very easy to type, like Cantonese. But also because I have my way of using flashcards, which works very well for me, and I've kind of bedded down over the years. And I don't want to be at the mercy of programs that try and get me to do different things. I like to be able to see the 2 different sides of the cards at the touch of a button, flip between them in the way that I want, and then use my own sort of mental way of processing the language and remembering the language to kind of do the heavy lifting. And I think that's a key point. I because I've got my way of working, I like to follow that way of working and do the heavy lifting of the memorizing, if you like, in my brain with the way that I know works for me. And any steps that you put in between me and doing that is just not going to work for me personally, right? So in that sense, for me, nothing is ever going to be a simple setup of flashcards with no gimmicks, which use spaced repetition. I like to use Flashcards Deluxe. That's the software that I use because it's really easy to get set up. Far less confusing than Anki, and it just works really well for me. I've got no reason to use anything else. Now, the other thing I've noticed with Memrise is that many people like to study the pre-written and pre-created courses there. So I gave the example earlier of the 5,000 most common Spanish words, or I don't know, 250 Spanish verbs, or something like that. Now, I'm not a big fan of this. I'm not a fan of using pre-written flashcards because there's too much you don't know. For a start, you don't know who made them. You don't know how they were selected. So, for example, if it's 250 Spanish verbs, how were they selected? Why were they selected? What's the criteria? And what makes you think they're going to be useful for you? Just because they are Spanish verbs, it doesn't mean they're Spanish verbs that you need, right? And then, so if you extend that to 5,000 Spanish words or whatever, how much time how many of those 5,000 words are you going to go to great pains to try and memorize without actually knowing whether you're ever going to need those words in the first place? And also because you're given words which are totally out of context, and the most effective way of learning any vocabulary is within context, right? So the benefit of creating your own flashcard decks is that you can see language in context. So, for example, you're watching a movie and you learn a new word from the context of the movie. So you've already got the context of that word, and then you can create your own flashcards. But because you've gone to the effort of creating your own flashcards, it's much more meaningful for you. You've chosen that word because you want to learn it. You've already heard it in context, so you kind of know how it should be used. You've got a lot of stuff there. When you just open up this deck that somebody else has made, you've got none of that context. So you're kind of learning arbitrary information without any of the features or qualities that make vocabulary useful or meaningful or easy to memorize in the first place. So it's a kind of uphill battle doing something that is not particularly useful for you. Now, obviously, within, if you've got a course of 5,000 words, obviously there will be some words in there that are useful. But for me, that's putting the cart before the horse. And the language learning is all about relevance. It's all about you making proactive decisions about the stuff that you want to learn. Because when you do that, that's when you really learn stuff more easily, and that's more relevant and practical to you. And that's how you can, make really fast progress. So when I see people kind of using a lot of other people's decks and pre-made courses of, frequency lists of words or whatever, I always I don't like it so much. I don't think it's a good habit to use. Now, having said all that, there may be lots of new features of Memrise which I don't know about. There might be lots of I don't know, there may even be courses there with lots of inbuilt context and stuff like that. I don't know. I'm totally willing to be educated on this, and I'm actually, as I said before, I'm planning on learning Italian this year, so I had it as a kind of mental note to go back and try using Memrise a little bit for that to see what I can find. So those are my thoughts, and again, I have to stress they may well be uninformed thoughts, but because I'm a little bit out of date, but I do try to base the stuff that I talk about on kind of principles which are timeless rather than specifics. If you are a regular Memrise user, maybe you want to put me in my place or correct me or add anything to what I've said, then please do. You come over to the show notes. They will be at iwillteachyoualanguage.com/episode 249. Now, a quick note on the show notes. As I may have mentioned before, we're in the process of upgrading the website, and as a consequence of that, we're kind of not publishing a lot of stuff on the website right now because we then have to, because we've already transferred across all the content, years of blog posts from the old site to the new site. And so anything that we now publish, we have to move across manually, which is a bit of a pain. So the show notes for the podcast might not be very up to date over the next few weeks or so. But that will be fixed over time, I promise. So if you do go over to the show notes and you find something resembling a shell, then it's not because I don't care. It's because we're just in the process of moving over to the new site. All right, then, at the end of every episode, I like to leave you with a resource of some kind on the topic of the show. And given that I've talked about flashcards and stuff today, I thought I'd point you in the direction of a book that I wrote. Well, it's not really a book, it's more of a guide, a 70-page or so guide, and it is a kind of comprehensive look at how I use flashcards. All right, so how I use flashcard software myself to learn and memorize vocabulary. It's a system that I've developed over the years, works really well for me, and a lot of other people have found it really useful as well. So if you'd like to pick up a copy, I think it's $7, so it's pretty, you can get that instead of your daily Starbucks. And you can find that by going to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/make-words-stick. That's the name of the guide. So once again, iwillteachyoualanguage.com/make-words-stick. Thanks for listening. See you back in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to today's episode, and in case you didn't already know, I teach languages in a rather unusual way through stories. Now, stories are a great way to learn a new language because when you're engrossed in a story, you remember things more easily, and the mechanics of the language just start clicking inside your brain. It's quite something, and if you'd like to find out how you can learn a new language or improve your skills in a language that you already know and do it with the power of stories, then you should check out my free Story Learning Kit, which will teach you exactly how this method works and how you can use it yourself to learn a new language. Visit storylearning.com/podkit, that's PODKIT, to get free access. Inside, you'll find explanatory videos, masterclasses, worksheets, short stories to practice with, and much, much more. Once again, that is storylearning.com/podkit, PODKIT. And if you're lucky, you might also find a link in the podcast description or show notes of this episode.